Well, it's time now to take a look back at the last week in politics. The Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, said he was pleased about those who acted responsibly yesterday as pubs opened their doors across England. But the city of Leicester could only watch as it became the first region to be put on local lockdown. Well, to talk it through, I'm joined now by Sonia Sodha, chief leader writer at The Observer, and Kate Andrews, economics correspondent at The Spectator. Thank you both so much for joining us. Sonia, let's start with you first of all. The relaxing of the lockdown, much concern about it, but it seems to have gone off all right, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, I think we might expect that people would still do their utmost to stick to social distancing. So I think that's good news. But the issue is that there are always going to be risks associated with a relaxation. And the question is that, experts like Sir David King, the former chief scientific advisor, is asking serious questions about this, because we've still got around 3,000 infections a day in England. And that is, some scientists considered to be too high. There are still risks of transmission, which lead to risks of a second spike, particularly in different localities in the UK. That's what we've seen in Leicester. So I think there are some scientists who would rather that we'd waited longer before doing this big relaxation and waited until we had a properly functioning test, track and trace scheme, and that's something that we've not got properly up and running yet from the government.
Kate, do you think it was too early to relax the lockdown, or are you welcoming it economically?
I'm welcoming it economically, but also socially. Humans are social creatures, and the vast majority of people locked down, followed the rules, followed the guidance. Those who weren't personally at risk did so anyway, because for people they didn't even know, surely for their parents and grandparents, but also for strangers, it was the right thing to do. But that kind of harsh lockdown is only sustainable for so long. I completely agree with Sonia. It's a real travesty that there isn't a proper track and trace system up yet, and a lot of that comes down to the government's decision to try to build its own rather than using the tried and tested app framework that Google and Apple had come up with. We don't expect one online till the autumn now. That does make people slightly more vulnerable, but I think this new emphasis on trusting the public and allowing people to assess their own risks and the risks around them and to be cautious of the safety of others is the right way to go. And I think the vast majority of people stayed within the guidance yesterday. Frankly, I think this is a moment to celebrate not just these renewed freedoms that we have, but also the fact that people are still being thoughtful. I think it is mostly a moment for celebration.
And Sonia, whilst we had the easing in some parts of the country in lockdown, in Leicester we had the renewed lockdown, and as Kate was saying, it did appear that people were quite happy to abide by new regulations if they were drafted in for a good reason.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people are, because I think the public have done really well in terms of compliance, and they get the seriousness of this. And in some ways, they're ahead of the government. I mean, the public started locking down really before the government introduced a mandated lockdown. But I think Leicester raises all sorts of serious questions, actually. The first is local MPs have raised questions about why it took so long to impose a lockdown, given that the government had data that was suggesting that there could be a spike there sort of 2 or 3 weeks before the government announced that it was going to be going into a citywide lockdown. And this has real consequences for the rest of England, I think, because what you want to do is you want to be keeping a very, very close eye on the numbers. And as soon as they start to tick upwards, you want to either sort of try and trace contacts and get people to stay at home if they've been in contact with people with symptoms, or introduce hyper-local lockdowns. And I think that the reason why Leicester had to have a citywide lockdown, which is obviously problematic for it economically, is because the government the monitoring systems aren't good enough and they left it too late. So I think there are serious questions about that. There were also very serious questions about areas of the country where we've got economic exploitation going on and illegal working practices. We know that's a problem in Leicester. There have been reports that some garment factories where people aren't even paid the minimum wage were continuing to operate throughout the pandemic, and that might be associated with the spike. And I think where we've got economic exploitation, that's going to be the real vulnerable points in terms of a second spike of infections.
Indeed. Another thing people were thinking quite a lot about this week, Kate, was the holidays. Air bridges hoved onto the political agenda. A certain amount of confusion about England and about where you could go, whether it was a traffic light system, whether it was yes or no, and differences with all the devolved administrations. Was it pretty chaotic?
It's been chaotic for months now. They've been briefing air bridges, I think predominantly because many Tory MPs weren't supportive of the government bringing in this 14-day quarantine to begin with. But because of that, you have a lot of different buzzwords like air bridges, which actually haven't really been implemented. It is more of a traffic light system. But of course, those countries don't necessarily have to reciprocate what the UK is offering. So if anybody is planning their holidays, they really need to look at the specifics of the government advice, which I've looked at myself. And I admit, it is a bit complex. I think we have to understand that as we try to get back to some kind of normality, there are going to be difficult moments like this. It isn't all going to be straightforward. We have to do the best we can to open up, and sometimes that's going to require a lot of fine print. I'm also concerned about these local lockdowns, however, because as Sonia points out, they're not that local because we don't have a proper track and trace system set up. Ideally, what you would do is target a school, target a particular company, target an office or a shop where people have been, so you can have as few people locking down as possible. If you have to lock down an entire city or region, that is a huge economic hit that area will be taking in the future. And I don't think the public totally understands yet, perhaps not even the government, how big an economic shock is coming. We are in a deep recession. More people are going to be unemployed before they gain employment again. Unfortunately, not everybody on the furlough scheme is going to keep their job. And if you have entire cities and areas that have to lock down in this way, it's going to make it even harder. So I think the necessity to be able to localize, do that very local lockdown, as Sonia talked about, is really crucial as we try to get back to normal.
I mean, Sonia, do you think that's a fair point? Do you think that we have actually, a lot of people haven't really thought about the economic impact, that they're just focusing on getting back to the pub, getting back to a job, the kids getting back to school?
No, I think people are really thinking about the economic impact. I think people are really worried about the future. Certainly people who I know who are on furlough are worried about the future of their jobs, which is kind of an entirely natural thing to be concerned about. And I think we're going into next week, we're about to see a summer statement from the Chancellor. There's a really big risk that consumer confidence is so fragile right now. People are worried about the fact that the lockdown is happening too early. I think they're rightly concerned about that. And they're also, they're not feeling that much like going out and spending loads of money because they're worried about their jobs. So I think there needs to be a real kind of injection of a stimulus into the economy, a demand stimulus to prop up consumer demand over the next few weeks. And we saw this weekend the think tank, the Resolution Foundation, call for a voucher scheme. So every adult gets a £500 voucher that they can spend in the hardest hit sectors like leisure, like face-to-face retail. And I think that's exactly the sort of scheme that we need to see. Otherwise, the risk is that going into the summer, people just aren't going to be spending, consumer confidence is going to be down, and we get caught in a downward spiral that takes this very deep recession that we're in, that Kate was talking about, and just makes it worse. So this would be entirely the wrong moment for the Chancellor to pull back from the interventionist approach that he's been taking in the economy in recent weeks.
Kate, what do you think about this voucher scheme, this idea of giving some people free money? Do you think it's a good idea? Will it help the economy?
I don't think it's the right tool to help the economy right now. I think the Chancellor does need to be bold, but the best thing the Chancellor could do is look to supply-side reforms to make it easier for employers to employ people and to keep them employed, because we need to get people back into work. I think giving people £500 or whatever this voucher may be to spend in an economy where it's difficult to get into a shop right now because capacity is limited because of social distancing, where Sonia says people even still might be nervous and they might pocket that money instead of spending it right now, isn't really going to stimulate the economy in the way that we need it to. So I think the real emphasis should be on making sure that job security is there, making sure that people, when they do feel safer to come back out, because regardless of government guidance, many people are choosing to still take this at a slower pace than others. When they choose to come back out, they'll have a job and they'll have places to go back into. So I'm hoping that the Chancellor will be bold. I should say, though, they're really trying to tone down what the Prime Minister announced this past week. It's not going to be a new deal. We are not looking at vast more amounts of spending, albeit we've already spent, hundreds of billions of pounds on this virus. It is a heavy spending year. They're trying to tone down what's coming and brief that come the autumn, we might expect some more initiatives. This statement will have stuff in it, but perhaps not as much as the Prime Minister indicated in the first place.
We're nearly out of time, but just wanted to get a quick thought from both of you. Sorry, Sonia, just need to quickly move on to Huawei. The government's changed its mind, it seems, do you think?
Yeah, it certainly seems like it. And people have been raising security concerns around Huawei, including conservative backbenchers, for months and months and months now. The pretext for the sort of change in decision is that there is a new report that's being presented to government which looks at the impact that US sanctions have had on Huawei and its ability to sort of operate as part of the UK's kind of 5G infrastructure. And so I think the government will use that as a pretext to change position. But I certainly think there have been kind of long-standing questions, given the relationship with China and the rest of the world, and given that we know there are kind of security risks around China. Why would we sort of be allowing a big chunk of our technology infrastructure to be operated by a company with such close links to the Chinese state?
And Kate, just final thought from you on that. I mean, Huawei, in response, is saying that it feels that the UK government is being dictated to by America, that America's barking and the UK is just doing what they want. What do you think to that?
I don't think that's where this is coming from. I think within the UK, you can see backlash from the public. There's been opinion polling suggesting that support for Huawei has seriously dwindled from politicians and the like. Coronavirus has changed the way that the UK and many other Western democracies are going to operate with China. I think Huawei is just a high-profile example of that. But it's not just going to be about technology. It's going to be about supply chains. It's going to be about operations across the board. And I think this is one to watch, certainly in terms of the relationship between China and its Western counterparts in the days and weeks and, frankly, years to come.
Kate Andrews and Sonia Sodha, thank you both so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.